Hi, I'm Alex Barron with Digital Research, and I'm here in downtown San Francisco with the CEO and co-founder of Rescale. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Joris Poort, the founder and CEO of Rescale. And Rescale is an enterprise simulation platform for companies in various spaces like automotive, aerospace, life sciences, and energy.
Okay, perfect. So Rescale, sounds like there's a ton of different use cases, of course. Can you walk me through just some of your top 3 use cases?
Yeah, absolutely. So a typical customer for us is a large enterprise company who's already utilizing simulation tools. And so a specific example might be an automotive company. So a company, you can think of a company like Tesla, doing crash testing of their cars. And so what they do is they simulate how the virtual model of the car and how that crashes against many different scenarios to try to make the car as safe as possible. And so what they do on Rescale is essentially run that simulation and then run many different iterations of that, many different scenarios to try to design the car in the most optimal way to make it get the best possible safety certification. Other examples might be our first customers, they were space companies. So the prototypes are extremely expensive. It's very hard to do physical testing. Or very expensive to do that. And so what they do is essentially use simulation to, again, design, for example, a propulsion system. And they do all the design and all the engineering work on this virtual model, and then they build a few of them and then test those. But because it's so expensive, they tend to use simulation tools, and what Rescale does essentially helps them run those simulations much faster and explore a much broader design space. And so that lets them get to a much better design, which ultimately saves them money and allows them to get a product to market more quickly.
Okay, perfect. Now, is there one really unique use case that you could talk about?
Sure. I think a good example would be a public example we have is Trek Bicycle. So they make consumer bicycles. And what they do is essentially try to design an optimal, aerodynamic shape for, their top performance riders on their bicycle team. And their highest end bicycles have both, have to have the best possible performance from a structural point of view, so make sure that the rider sitting on the bike has kind of the optimal position, and then on top of that, the best aerodynamics, and of course the lightest weight. And so this might sound like a simple problem, but actually when you start combining all the different elements of how you change the structure, it affects the aerodynamic shape and it affects the weight, and all these things interact with each other. So when you can combine all these different simulation tools and run kind of an optimization across all the different effects at the same time, you can end up designing a much better performing bicycle. So that'd be an interesting example.
Yeah, sure, that's pretty interesting. So it sounds like there's a lot of really great engineering use cases. Are there any applications outside of engineering, like within business or other areas that you can use Rescale for?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a high-performance computing platform for any simulation tool. And so our first customers are really in aerospace and automotive, but other sectors that have similar kind of applications are, for example, life sciences. In drug development, they use simulation tools to essentially evaluate the quality of different compounds and how they bond to specific targets. So it's really in helping screen through millions of different compounds and computationally predict which drug is going to perform better. And so that helps save, if it costs $1 billion to go through an entire product development cycle for a drug, that drug discovery cycle can be reduced by maybe 50%, and so it's very valuable to companies. Another application would be financial services, where they're doing a lot of analysis around and simulating different scenarios for various different mortgage portfolios or applications like that. And so we're really just on the start of that. Other sectors we also operate in are energy. So in energy, we're looking at reservoir simulation, so both in trying to predict where oil is and then extract the oil in the most efficient way possible. Another interesting application is in semiconductors. So doing chip design, chips are very complicated and many different ways to essentially organize the optimal chip design. And so essentially an infinite number of combinations. And so if you can simulate those and see which ones perform better than others, that's a very efficient way to get to kind of a more optimal design.
Okay, perfect. Now, let's say I'm an automotive company and I want to start using Rescale. What's the setup and implementation process to get up to speed on running simulations?
Sure. So basically, a typical company would already be running simulation tools. So we have a library of over 120 different software applications that you can choose from. And essentially, these are anything from an open source package to a commercial tool. And you would pick one of these packages. For example, we have a partner of ours, Siemens. They have a few different structural analysis tools. You pick one of these packages, you set up your design, and then you go on to Rescale, and you can essentially simulate many different scenarios for your analysis. Once you have ran through this analysis, then you can do different post-processing tasks as well. And what Rescale specifically does, it helps put this entire simulation on the cloud. So by putting it on the cloud, you essentially get unlimited amount of hardware resources, which allow you to really scale up the size of the problems you can run and allows you to run them much more quickly. So as an example, some companies, they might spend on a fluid dynamics problem, you might spend several weeks just running it on a server to get an answer. And on Rescale, they might be able to get the same answer in just a few hours. So it really changes the possibilities, because now you can run thousands of them at the same time and get that answer really quickly.
Okay, interesting. Now, obviously you just touched on this, and I understand most of the competitors in this market are on-premise solutions.
That's right.
Can you talk about some of the challenges, but also some of the benefits of a company moving to a cloud solution like Rescale?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the challenges is today there's about $20 billion spent every year on building on-premise high-performance computing data centers. And so this is what companies are used to, and still 95% of all the business, it's all done on-premise, which might surprise some people because cloud computing is obviously becoming quite prevalent. But that said, for high-performance computing, the bar is pretty high for both the performance of the servers and there's a lot of highly proprietary data, so security is like a critical component as well. So making that transition, our original product we launched several years ago, essentially targeted towards engineers and scientists to be able to run all these simulations. And it's a SaaS platform that's built in the web browser. So very easy to access, easy to run. But the challenge is most of these people running these really complex simulations are working at very large companies with very complicated enterprise IT systems. And so recently we launched a product called ScaleX Enterprise, and what this does, it lets a company easily transition from on-premise to cloud. And so what it lets you do is essentially hook in Rescale system into your on-premise scheduler and your on-premise tools that you're using. And then over time, typically a 2 or 3 year period, really transition from running everything on-premise to starting to use cloud and eventually complete replacement. And this, making this transition is certainly something every CIO is thinking about. And this tool essentially helps them do that, and especially do it in the most secure way possible. One specific advantage of reason people are using Rescale is that we have a global network of all the largest kind of data centers in the world. And so what this lets us do is allow customers to access both the best possible hardware and also at the lowest possible kind of operational costs. And so that's why if you run it on-premise, especially if you're, for example, in Japan, the operational costs are extremely high due to the energy costs. And so with cloud computing, you have the option to both run in our data centers in Japan, but you might also be interested in running in the US, where you're able to get a much lower operational cost for the exact same kind of computing simulations.
Okay, interesting. So you have data centers all over the world, but are these partners or are these data centers that you maintain yourselves?
Yeah, it's all through our partners. So, our companies, they're used to being able to get access to thousands or tens of thousands of servers. So for us to actually build out all that infrastructure, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially when we have a network of very strong partners. It includes the leading kind of supercomputing centers in the world, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all the kind of top players in cloud computing. Now, any of our infrastructure partners, they do need to meet the highest level of kind of security standards in the industry. So we do go through an SOC 2 compliance with all our data center partners, and then Rescale as a company themselves as well. And so lets us really maintain the highest level of security regardless of where the customer is running.
Okay, perfect. Now let's change gears a bit, and I'd love to know about what you were doing before Rescale.
Sure. So I'm classically trained as a mechanical engineer. I also have a degree in applied math and in aerospace. And before Rescale, I worked at Boeing for 5 years. And essentially, while I was working at Boeing, we were developing a lot of the simulation tools and methods used to design the 787 wing design. And this actually led us to starting the company eventually, because we spent many years, and I wrote my master's thesis on connecting different simulation tools and how to scale out these problems. And this was over 10 years ago, so before kind of cloud computing was that prevalent. And we were running on Boeing's data centers. And so we were running on about 80% of all of Boeing's compute power over the weekend. We had to get special permission to be able to do that. But we were able to solve for the 787 a pretty significant weight challenge. And so we ended up saving the company, Boeing, over $180 million just through weight improvement. And we took a design cycle that was taking 3 months, and we were able to take that down to 24 hours. And this was all through scaling out the simulation tools, integrating tools together. And that eventually led us to, several years later, with my co-founder, who was the lead engineer on the 787 wing, Adam, and we started the company, a few years later after we both had left Boeing.
Okay, excellent. So you start the company. What were the early days like? Was it challenging? Was it fun? Long hours? Could you talk about what it was like?
Sure. When I first, had the idea to start the company, it was really when cloud computing was starting to take off. I was actually in business school at the time, it started as just an idea, and I started working on it more. And as you start, working on it, I was getting much more passionate about what I was doing. I previously worked at McKinsey as well, and so I was considering, do I start the company or do I go back and join McKinsey or some other path? And it was really through, I was pretty passionate about it. I spent, so many years solving these specific problems around, simulation, and I thought there was such a big opportunity that if other people had the same tools, that we were able to use at Boeing, where we were able to solve these huge problems. If we had a platform that made it really easy to do that, so many other people, both at Boeing, but also many other companies, would be able to utilize that to solve these problems. So that really led me to decide to kind of start the company. And then, it was pretty tough going in the beginning. So we probably pitched over 70 investors early on. And in the beginning, I was just by myself, and I was trying to, raise money. This was in a time, so about 5 years ago, when social, local, mobile were kind of the hot things, and we were not social or local or mobile. That made it pretty challenging. But eventually, I kept going, built the first version of the product, had Adam join, and then Paul Graham from Y Combinator, he kind of, I think, took a little bit of risk on us because enterprise was not really a popular kind of category for both investors or at Y Combinator. But he was very interested in what the potential was to impact the aerospace industry and other industries with what we could build. And so he took an early bet on us, and since then we were able to get our kind of first customers in space, and then we got other investors excited as well.
Could you talk about getting your first investors in aerospace?
Sure. So once we got a little bit of traction with space companies, one of our other early investors is Jeff Bezos, and so he actually has a space company, and he also obviously is running Amazon, which has Amazon Web Services. So he's both intimately familiar with kind of the cloud computing paradigm, but also he understood why kind of an aerospace company can't just use the same tools that a standard cloud computing kind of commodity web services offering has. And there's a big gap there, and that's exactly what we essentially built Rescale for. And so that I think he saw that he already had that thesis, and he talked about these challenges actually years before Rescale existed, and that made us, I think, fit exactly into where he thought a company should exist. And so I would say, we got pretty lucky that he ended up, being able to kind of find out about us, and then he invested. Another early investor was, Sam Altman and Peter Thiel. And I think, Peter Thiel has talked a lot about this in his books. There's kind of 0 to 1, for example. I think a great book, and it talks a lot about the opportunity for companies to build very valuable tools for man-machine symbiosis, which really means computers are really good at doing certain tasks like just crunching numbers and going through algorithms, and humans are really good at strategic thinking. And so his companies like PayPal and Palantir, all at the core of it, for PayPal they had a system to be able to detect fraud using computers and humans, and so there's a man-machine symbiosis thesis. Same thing for Palantir, like human networks and using like analysts in the government to be able to detect like terrorist cells and things like that. And so for engineering and science, Rescale is the same analogy, where you have kind of the analysts, which are the engineers or scientists, and then Rescale is a platform which then lets you run many different simulations and really leverage tens of thousands of servers, and you only need one really smart engineer or scientist who can run these massive computations and simulations.
Okay, so Peter Thiel's a good name, Sam Altman, good name, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, I hear as well.
Yeah, that's
investor.
Right. Yeah.
So all these big names, how did they find Rescale? Now I know Y Combinator obviously you must have applied, but these other brand name investors, how do they find Rescale?
Yeah, it's it's a good question. I think it's a relatively tight community within Silicon Valley. When we started the company, I did move actually to San Francisco for the pure purpose of starting the company, and that's a big benefit of being in the Valley. It's a very meritocratic environment where anybody can come and start a company, and people treat each other and help each other in very positive ways. And so I think the challenge with fundraising is that it's either kind of all working or not working at all. So for us, for a long time, it wasn't working, and it was partially, I think, people didn't understand it. It's very there's a lot of like deep intellectual property and technology built into the platform that is hard to communicate until you've built it and demonstrated it works. And so for us, a big change was, we actually had, big enterprise companies and space companies actually using it for, in some cases, even like, defense level projects. And that really, I think, allowed investors to look at that, basically proof and traction that people are paying for it, people are using it. And so I think that helped a lot. But the big names really, a lot of them also look at, other people, what are they investing in? And usually they already have some theses built into their own minds, and what does like a good company look like, what are they excited about investing in. And so to be completely honest, I think we just got pretty lucky because Richard Branson, he's got Virgin Galactic, also involved in space activities. Peter Thiel, from kind of PayPal, and he's friends with Elon Musk, right? And so he's an investor in there as well. And so they're pretty tight circles, and they all like to invest in certain categories. So, but for a lot of them, they're already all pretty wealthy. So I think a lot of them, it's also a passion behind it. They think that this type of company should exist and they could be very valuable. But a big part about Silicon Valley that I think is also really nice is that a lot of people aren't, especially in the early stage investing, they're not doing it just for the money. So certainly Paul Graham, I think he invested just because I think he really thought the company should exist, not in doing it because he's there to make hundreds of millions of dollars or anything like that. Now over time, later investors, that becomes very important, and so now we're a much bigger company, and when we do fundraising now, it is a lot about how good is the business, and you're there to make the investors more money, and so that's what we're doing today.
Okay, makes sense. But I think having those early investors that, of course they want to get a return, but they also just want to see your company in existence is really important, and it just kind of is that social proof or stamp of approval on your company that brings more and more investors. So it's really cool to have that. But we should probably wrap soon, so I have two last questions. One is what's next for Rescale?
Yeah, so we're growing very fast, and like like I was mentioning, actually Japan is a big market for us. We just actually closed a distribution deal with Itochu and CTC America to distribute our software in Japan. So that's very exciting. And we're growing very quickly. So we're expanding the sales team, marketing team, and it's really to help kind of address this kind of global set of customers that we have. We just launched our enterprise product, so we're really excited to have. We already have a few kind of Fortune 50 companies that are using it, and to help get further feedback on that, keep improving that, we're just excited to grow quickly.
All right, perfect. And finally, where's the best place for people to go and learn more and get started with Rescale?
So you can just go to rescale.com, and lots of information there. If you're interested in partnering with us, being a customer, or working with us, all the information is there. And if you're interested in working at Rescale, there's a careers page where you can apply for jobs as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Joris, and best of luck.
All right. Thanks a lot for your time.